Welcome to the web series Exploring 9/11, The World Before and After, a production of the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. I'm Clifford Shannon. I'm speaking today with Alex Thier, Director of the Future of Afghanistan project at the U.S. Institute for Peace in Washington. Alex has a long history of involvement in Afghanistan. From 1993 to 1996, he lived there and worked for the United Nations, and then again returned in 2002, where he spent 2 years as a legal advisor to the Afghan government, working on constitutional and rule of law issues. He is the editor of a volume called The Future of Afghanistan that's just put out by the U.S. Institute of Peace. It can be gotten from their website, www.usip.org. Alex, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Many things to ask you today, but as a matter of curiosity, your involvement with things Afghan begins at least in the early 1990s, one of the more obscure and unapproachable parts of the world, I guess. What brought your interest to the subject and studying the language and the culture, and how did you get to Afghanistan?
In 1992, I was working for a project called the Humanitarianism and War Project at Brown University. And it was looking at how humanitarian assistance is delivered into zones of conflict. And we didn't have somebody who had spent time in Afghanistan to help us with our research, and so the directors of the project asked me to start researching Afghanistan and to get information about what was going on at the time in Afghanistan during what was the Civil War after the Soviet Union pulled out. And I started to do a lot of research and became very interested in it, and decided that what I wanted to do was to actually go to Afghanistan to help it transition from war to peace. Because at the time, in 1992, there was the idea that there would be a negotiated resolution to the Afghan conflict, and that the rebel groups or mujahideen groups that had been fighting against the communists were going to take over the government, and the Afghan communist government, which had been backed by the communists, by the Soviet Union, would step aside. And so I was hoping to go essentially to do post-conflict reconstruction in Afghanistan. And I got myself a very small grant and a plane ticket and showed up in Pakistan trying to find a way to work there.
And as such things, 15 years later and more, you're still working on these issues.
That's right. I ended up not knowing how long I was going for, but spending 4 years in Afghanistan during the devastating civil war that they had in the 1990s. And then after 9/11, got very quickly drawn back into Afghanistan because of my experience there.
Well, we will come to the history of the 80s, 90s, and so on in Afghanistan later in our conversation, but I do think it's important to begin by trying to situate the country physically. Its most important neighbor, at least from contemporary concerns, is Pakistan to its east. It also borders on the west with Iran, so it has two rather important and prominent neighbors who play a role in its affairs. But can you situate the country geographically for us?
Sure.
Talk about the topography, what it's like. It's certainly a poor country, but I think we need to know more than that.
Well, the territory that is Afghanistan today has largely been that territory since the middle of the 18th century, although the borders really weren't set until the end of the 19th century. Afghanistan is in, I think, the heart of what we might think of as Central Asia. And it has always been a bridge between continents. To Afghanistan's east, you have Pakistan and India, which of course, before the 1950s was united as South Asia or India, the subcontinental area. And then to Afghanistan's north, you have Central Asia, the republic of Central Asia that used to be part of the Soviet Union, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan. And to Afghanistan's west, you have Iran. Afghanistan has sat at the crossroads of empires for centuries. Alexander the Great's empire went through Afghanistan. You had the Mughal empires, you had many of the Persian empires, and so it's always kind of been in the middle of these areas. And one of the reasons for that is that Afghanistan is one of the most mountainous countries in the world. It is very high altitude where a lot of people live, and most of Afghanistan consists of narrow valleys and rivers, and the population lives largely along those rivers. The other reason that Afghanistan has always been this crossroads, really from all the way from China to Europe. In fact, Marco Polo wrote about Afghanistan, is because the mountains are so extreme going into the north of Afghanistan and into the Himalayas that there are only a few good land routes that go from Asia into what we know as the Middle East and Europe, and those pass through Afghanistan. And of course, there's the famous Khyber Pass. In the period that Afghanistan was really starting to become a nation state, the 1880s, there was also the period often referred to as the Great Game, where you had the Russians coming in from the north, and you had the British who controlled India coming in from the east, and they essentially agreed to make Afghanistan a buffer state between them. And so they drew these boundaries in the last part of the 19th century, which largely have remained today. And so you have this state of Afghanistan being formed largely because of what was around it. It's also important to note that Afghanistan is landlocked. And so Afghanistan is very heavily, even more so than many other countries, dependent on its neighbors. And because it's in a tumultuous neighborhood, it's in a difficult neighborhood, its history has often seen turmoil not only internally, but as a result of what's going on around it.